welcome everyone to the final installment for the Institute of Corporate Governance and Ethics Fall 2025 Speaker Series. I'm Todd Haw, Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School and the Faculty Director of the ICGE. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by Marco Becht, the Executive Director of the European Corporate Governance Institute, who will serve as our moderator. And of course, also our wonderful speaker, Professor Zachary Sauntner from the University of Zurich. But before I turn things over to Marco, I'd like to say a quick word about the ICGE. The Institute for Corporate Governance and Ethics was relaunched a year ago with the aim of taking a broader, more interdisciplinary, and more systems-based approach to corporate governance and ethics research. Not only did we want to ensure that we were considering corporate governance in its full scope, which includes the areas of finance, management, corporate law, corporate compliance, business and behavioral ethics, and financial controls, but we also wanted to make sure that that research was more accessible to business practitioners. And so as part of that relaunch, the ICGE brought Ethical Systems, which is a consortium of business and behavioral ethics scholars, to the Kelley School, which doubled the number of our faculty affiliates and created an entirely new network of collaborators under the ICGE umbrella, as well as a new platform to reach business leaders. So by bringing the ICGE and Ethical Systems together, we've created a one-of-a-kind institution that is able to harness the best academic research to aid scholars, policymakers, business leaders, and students in elevating corporate governance and ethical business practices within their organization. And this speaker series is just one of the ways that we're doing that. So please check out our websites and LinkedIn for new initiatives and activities coming from the ICGE and Ethical Systems in the future. And I should also mention that we just issued our first report. So you can see everything that we've been doing over the last year or so in one digital space. So just take a look at the website to find that report that's now up on our blog. And so with that, let me introduce our moderator, Professor Marco Becht. Professor Becht is the Professor of Finance and the Goldschmidt Chair Professor of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at the Salve Brussels School of Economics and Management at the Free University of Brussels, where he teaches courses on corporate governance and responsible capitalism. In addition, Marco is a founding member and fellow, as well as the executive director of the European Corporate Governance Institute, which of course many of you know is an international nonprofit that provides a platform for debate and dialogue among academics and policymakers and business leaders around the topics of corporate governance, ESG, and stewardship. We've been a longtime supporter of ECGI. We greatly appreciate all the support that they've given us as an institute, particularly as we've sought to expand our mission, as I mentioned. And so I want to thank you, Marco, and the entire ECGI staff and the organization's larger governance community. ECGI is not the only governance organization that Marco is involved with. He is also a fellow in financial economics at the Center for Economic Policy Research. He co-founded the Global Corporate Governance Colloquial Series, and he's held a series of visiting fellow and professor positions at some of the top law and business schools in the world, including Oxford, Stanford, and Columbia. And finally, beyond his academic activities, Marco is deeply engaged in policymaking and practice as a board member of the Kangaroo Group at the European Parliament, as a member of the Group of Financial Market Law Experts at the German Ministry of Finance, and as a senior academic advisor to Axera, an economic consultancy. So Marco, thank you so much again for being here and for being our moderator today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Todd. So in January, February, I was asked what has changed at ECGI given current developments, and I said actually nothing. We continue to collaborate with our colleagues around the world, and we bring the best research to a global audience. And that's what we're doing today. And we are at ECGI. The network is really grateful to you, Todd, for bringing your professionalism to the venture and to continue to collaborate with the rest of us. So you've invited today Zacharias Sauntner, who is one of the most prolific, well-published, productive research members of ECGI in this space. So he's published in the top journals, his stuff is widely cited. Now, that's good, but you also have to add to this, it's not just that, but his research is actually, first of all, interesting, which is not always a given. And secondly, it's relevant. And I think the paper he is going to present today just speaks to that. We mustn't forget that despite what you read in some of the papers, we have the warmest year we've had in history. We have more natural disasters than ever before. We witnessed Indonesia last year, just recently, not last year, this year, etc. So these facts just don't go away. And Zacharias is going to tell us about a link that is with politics. So you can even call this in December 2025 courageous. Let's not forget that COP Brazil, according to newspapers, had the largest number of fossil fuel lobbyists ever at any COP. So it really is a paper that speaks to the times we live in. And I'm delighted to give the floor to Zacharias to hear the research that he and his colleagues have done. Thank you very much, Zacharias.
Thank you very much, Marco. It's an honor to be here and be in this series, given all the other great scholars that have been presenting here. I should also add that I'm standing here because of Marco, and not in the sense of him having invited me, but actually I was basically able to pursue a career in academia because Marco was lobbying the European Commission to fund a European training network on corporate governance successfully. And so that provided me with the opportunity to do a postdoc at Oxford at Saïd Business School, and then go on the job market and get my first academic job. So I'm deeply grateful to Marco for having set up as part of ECGI this doctoral network. And I'm also grateful to many co-authors and friends that have supported me on this journey, and some of them are actually participants today, as I've seen. So I'm very glad to have some familiar faces or names in the audience. So in terms of the paper, it's going to be about corporate climate lobbying. And I want to start with the big picture that is kind of behind this paper and behind the work more broadly that I've been doing on climate and more recently on nature biodiversity topics. I think parts of the backlash that we've seen with respect to sustainable finance is because we haven't done sufficiently well the distinction that Laura Starks in her presidential address pointed out, which is to separate value and values when talking about sustainable investing. And Laura, who is also a participant today, has made this point because if you pursue ESG topics from a values perspective, the motives may be political, may be moral, and that can be challenged if there's a change in the political climate. And it may even be challenged on economic grounds because, you may say then you're violating a fiduciary duty or you're not optimizing risk-return dimensions. But this is not the case, as I show in my work, if you approach ESG, sustainable finance, from a value perspective, of a financial perspective. And so in my work, I've tried to show in different settings that climate and more recently also biodiversity or nature risks constitute financially material investment risks. And therefore, whatever your political perspective is and whatever morally you think about biodiversity loss or climate change, you cannot ignore that from a fiduciary duty perspective, from an investment perspective. And I say this because, as you will also see here in this paper, I'm not going to moralize and kind of judge from a values perspective whether climate lobbying, especially anti-climate lobbying, is good or bad. That's not the point of the paper. The point of the paper is first to try to measure it, and second, to evaluate whether there are investment risks associated with anti-climate lobbying in particular. Because then we have a platform, a base to talk about it, because then we can say, well, if there is an investment risk, should we address it and how should we address it? So this paper is together with my co-authors, Markus Leipold and Tingyu Yu, and I want to mention in particular Tingyu Yu, because she's a postdoc here and she's currently on the job market, and some of you may have seen her application. And I can say, 100% convinced she's phenomenal. And all the credit that you see here in the paper goes really to Ting Yu. Let me tell you the paper based on a story, based on a narrative, a real narrative. I organized a few months ago, or co-organized a few months ago, an event here where I had lunch with the CEO of a Swiss investor coalition that was set up by Swiss pension funds. So the Swiss pension funds basically jointly engage companies through that investor coalition. And as you may know, Switzerland has a lot of very, very big pension funds, because also here we have a, different from Germany, for example, a pension system that is capital-based. And so as she was sitting next to me, and she didn't know about my paper, I was asking her basically, how her day-to-day activities are going, and she was very frustrated. Why was she frustrated? So she told me that recently she has written a letter to the European Commission asking the European Commission to define very clearly industrial standards on so-called green cement. You may know cement is contributing to about 5% of global climate change because of the emissions associated in particular with the clinker, the material that goes into cement production. So as the clinker is produced, there is CO2 that is basically going as part of the production process into the atmosphere. And that is an important driver of climate change. Now, there are companies that have a new product, a new sort of green clinker that comes with a 90% lower carbon footprint. And it's not the big cement companies, it's small innovative companies. And she, representing the Swiss pension funds in terms of the engagement, was writing to the European Commission, asking the European Commission to define clear industrial standards that would basically approve for users of the cement, this green cement. Because you may know, a construction company is only allowed to use a certain cement if it is standardized, right? If there's a clear categorization that you're allowed to use the cement. And that doesn't yet exist for this green cement. So she was writing to the European Commission asking for an industrial standard for that low carbon clinker. Now, why did she do this? Well, because her pension funds are investing in cement companies. And these cement companies, as I just said, they have a very big carbon footprint. She's worried about this carbon footprint. And she has understood how important it is to put innovative pressure on these on these cement companies to lower their footprint. And one way to do this is to have entry into the industry to put competitive pressures on the incumbents to reduce their emissions, to adapt some of the technologies, to be faster in themselves developing green cement. And they do have some green cement developments as well, of course, but it's not as innovative in terms of reducing emissions as the other. So she clearly did this because she had a financial motive. She has the idea of writing this letter not to support primarily the startups, because she probably doesn't invest in them or their pension funds, but because she wants to put pressure on the cement companies to decarbonize. So she spoke to people at the commission, and they promised that, and they first said, we totally understand, we're fully on your page. And they basically promised to kind of revise the regulation and kind of make the standardization of this low emission clinker. Now, some time passed, and the final regulation came out. And when she saw the final regulation, she was shocked. Because in that final regulation, the SEP paragraph that would standardize that low emission clinker was deleted from the initial draft. And why was it deleted from the initial draft? Well, we don't know. She doesn't know 100%, but she has very clear cues that it is because some cement companies are so well connected in Brussels with lobbyists on the street that they managed to get that specific regulation, which is a competitive threat to them, out of the regulation. And this is what the paper is about. It's about the narrative that I've just been telling you, that pro-climate regulation is in some instances impeded, prevented by incumbents with a large carbon footprint. Now, let me step back and think a little bit more about the bigger picture behind the paper, kind of going away from this narrative. Now, if you ask economists, what should we do to address climate change? 95% of the economists you ask will come with an answer saying, well, a carbon tax or a cap and trade scheme or something similar. There's clear agreement. Now, we don't see it. We don't see it at scale. Right? We still see in lots of countries and for lots of segments of the industry that are carbon intensive, that there is not yet a price, and in particular not a proper price for carbon. And so the important question, I think, for all of us to answer is, why is it not happening? And there are multiple reasons, right? And certainly it's also related to myopia among politicians. It's always unpopular to introduce a new tax. It's related to practical implementation challenges. Think of cross-border adjustment mechanisms if some countries like the EU introduce a carbon tax and others don't. But, and I hope I've illustrated this point in the example just now, it's also because some companies are very successful in preventing, in obstructing the policy process, regulation, to prevent stricter regulation. And this is what the paper is about. We try to measure it. We try to quantify anti, but also pro-climate lobbying. We try to study it, and we try to see how investors think about the lobbying. So when I mean lobbying, I mean effort with the goal to influence policymakers to undermine, delay, or avoid pro-climate regulations or policy. This is what I mean or define as anti-climate lobbying. And anti-climate lobbying is not a sideshow. It's not just something that we measure and no one cares about it. Well, actually, there are papers that show at the kind of micro level that such anti-climate lobbying is successful. And, my example maybe brought this point already home, but there's also other work that you see cited here that shows, for example, when there was a proposal to introduce a United States-wide carbon tax or cap and trade scheme. This failed. That's what the paper shows, because of lobbying, because lobbyists were successful in changing the marginal votes, right? And that's why some NGOs have actually started to label anti-climate lobbying as scope 4 emissions, to illustrate that some companies' impact on climate change through the lobbying activities is bigger than through the company's scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions combined. Now, here's the challenge for us as researchers. Corporate lobbying occurs behind the scenes. It's hard to observe. It sometimes even collides with public statements on what firms plan to do to fight climate change. There are firms that go out there and say, we are fully aligned with the Paris Agreement's goal, but in private, negotiate against rules and regulations that bring us to that goal. And a case in point is here. This is an amazing video. Maybe some of you have watched the video. So it's a video for which a top lobbyist of ExxonMobil was tricked into what looked like a job interview. So this gentleman here was on a Zoom call thinking he's being interviewed for another job. The interviewers were actually an NGO that have set up this fake interview. And in that interview, and you can watch the video online, it's on YouTube, this lobbyist is bragging how he is using bait, literally bait, towards senators to undermine President Biden's climate bill, how he is basically supporting shadow groups, climate scientists that help undermine the climate consensus. So this was a unique opportunity for the public, because it was recorded, to see what was happening behind the scenes. And I say that because ExxonMobil in public makes very different statements. You will read statements that they are committed towards the Paris Agreement, while it seems that behind the scenes, this is not what was going on. Now, I should add, when that came out, maybe unsurprisingly, this person was fired, and ExxonMobil also stated that what this person said is not representing the values of ExxonMobil, and so on and so forth. Now, as I said, what we do in this paper is we quantify corporate anti, but also pro-climate lobbying, the expenses associated with it. We identify the largest corporate lobbyists. We then establish how climate lobbying relates to corporate business models. So what kind of firms do more or less climate lobbying, anti and also pro-climate lobbying? And then eventually we look at the question that came up early in my example. Well, do investors care about anti-climate lobbying? And when I mean, do they care about it, I in particular try to ask the question whether there is risk that is, with lots of quotation marks, priced in financial markets, in the sense that those firms that are doing a lot of anti-climate lobbying see a higher expected return, a higher cost of capital in financial markets because of the lobbying creating risks. So now, the first and I think biggest part of the paper is really trying to quantify anti, but also pro-climate lobbying. And so we do this in 2 steps. And I would say we probably agree on the first step, how we measure climate lobbying. And we may disagree on the second step, which is how we sign the direction of the lobbying, whether it's pro or anti-climate lobbying. For the second step, it's a little bit like religion. If you believe it, you have to believe everything, and you cannot just, not believe a single piece of it, because then you're gonna not, believe in the whole paper, basically. So let me illustrate. So how do we measure climate lobbying? You may know that in the United States, at the federal level, which is the level we measure lobbying, firms already since the 90s have to file on a quarterly basis lobbying reports. So they have to report publicly which measures they undertake in order to influence basically federal decision making. So it can be in the House, in the Senate, but also the EPA or elsewhere. So in these lobbying reports, you see the issues that are lobbied on. So they're enumerated. So there's a set of bullet points, and each bullet point describes a different issue that the company lobbies on. So we are basically reading in an automized way these issue descriptions. And we use keywords to search whether in any of these issues that are enumerated, there is a climate-related term in there. And if it is in there, we would say, let's say it's in 1 out of 4 issues, that in 1 out of the 4 issues that the firm lobbies on, there is climate lobbying. Now, there are lots of details. One detail is that it's not just the companies that lobby. Lots of companies actually hire lobbyists as well, that then file on behalf of the company these lobbying reports. And of course, we also take those into account. A second, an important detail, as you'll see in a moment, is that sometimes that's not a climate-related keyword that pops up in the issue description, but a reference to a bill that is climate-related. How do we know? Well, we apply the same keywords also to the bills to identify bills as being climate-related or not. So if that bill code, this bill name pops up in the issue description, we will also say that issue is climate-related. Even more importantly, sometimes there is an abstract bill code mentioned in the description. HR 4396 here in the bottom of the chart. That's a bill. And so what we also do is we link the bill codes to the bills to make sure that if an issue description just mentions an abstract bill code of a bill that is climate related, that we also capture. Now, what you also know is how much the company spends overall on lobbying. So if there are 4 items in the issue descriptions, and the company says they spend $1 million in total, we do not know how much they spend on each individual issue. So we make an assumption. We basically do 1 over n. So if there are 4 issues, we assume, and one of them is climate related, that 1/4 of the 1 million is spent on climate lobbying. So that's how we get the amounts. Now, of course, there's also the issue that some lobbying takes place not by companies themselves, but through trade associations. So I won't have time to go into this, but we've spent 3 months on also making sure that we're measuring indirect lobbying through trade associations and attributing this to individual firms. First step. Now we know how much a company in a given quarter or year is spending on climate lobbying. We do not know if it's anti or pro-climate lobbying, in favor or against stricter regulation. So this is where the second step comes in. And so we are following another paper by Kwon et al. That does something similar for environmental lobbying. So what we do is, well, what we intended to do first, let me start like this, was let's look at the companies that are spending money on climate lobbying and see whether the companies are supporting the Republicans or the Democrats. And then we thought if the companies themselves are donating, not lobbying, donating money to the Republicans, we classify the lobbying of the firm as anti-climate. And if they donate to the Democrats, we classify it as pro-climate. That was our first idea. But that doesn't work because, as you probably know, companies donate to both sides. So that's why then in a second thought, and that follows the Kwon et al. Paper, we said, well, then maybe what's more informative is not where the companies are donating the money to, but the executives. So you learn something about the political stance of the companies by looking at where the executives of the companies or the lobbyists that they hire, where they donate to. So clearly, there are important assumptions behind that, and I'll talk about them in a moment. Right? For example, that the Republicans are anti-climate and the Democrats are pro-climate. Yeah, but before getting there, let me just give you a flavor of where the data is coming from. So the data on climate lobbying, the lobbying reports, is available for all of you from Open Secrets. And since the Lobbying Disclosure Act, firms have to file these lobbying reports. So we have downloaded about 260,000 lobbying reports from about 4,000 US listed firms. And then in the second step, of course, we had to look at the political donations of the executives. So we use FEC data, and we're able now for 150,000 reports to actually do the classification that I was just mentioning, whether the executives donate to the Republicans or Democrats. And now if you go to the level of climate lobbying, we find that about 10% of all the reports contain at least one item in the issue description that is climate-related lobbying. And so for about 15,000 of the reports where we can do the matching, the linking to the executives' donations, we know the direction of the climate lobby. And it's about 50-50. About half of the lobbying we classify as anti and half as pro-climate. Now, as I said, there are some key assumptions that are underlying our signing of the direction. Well, first, that dominating predominantly to the Democratic Party implies supporting someone that is pro-climate, and to the Republican Party supporting someone that is anti-climate. Again, I'm not here to say this is morally good or bad. That's not the point. Now, this assumption is very plausible. You see that top right here on the slide. So this is data from the League of Conservation Voters. So they are scoring the voting behavior of senators and House of Representatives members, and whether they are voting pro or anti-environment, right? Not climate specifically, but environmental, right? If the number is towards 1, then they vote usually in favor of pro-climate, pro-environmental regulation. If it's close to 0, usually against it. And you can see very clearly here for the House of Representatives and for multiple years that usually the Democrats vote more pro-environment and the Republicans more anti-climate. That's the classification that the LCV has been doing. So I think that assumption is, pretty clear. Also, if you look at important regulation like the Inflation Reduction Act, who was voting in favor and again against, it usually aligns with it. Yeah? You know that the Inflation Reduction is basically the biggest climate law, pro-climate law that we've seen in the US. Now, the other point is that the climate stance of executives is clear and informative about the stance of the company. Well, that's also plausible, as we argue. And there's lots of anecdotal evidence for that. But also what is kind of interesting is to see that usually executives are really either supporting just the Democrats or just the Republicans. And you see that here in the bottom right. So we looked at where the executives are donating money to. And so 0 is if all the money goes to the Republicans, and 1 if all goes to the Democrats. You basically see there's nothing in between. Right? So there are hardly any executives that donate to both sides. So it's clear partisanship. Even more interestingly, it looks, and this is actually the figure here, it looks like this if you look at the entire executive team. So there's partisanship in the executive teams. Either the entire team supports the Republicans or the Democrats. Very little in between. All right, so let me summarize. How do we quantify anti and pro-climate lobbying? Well, we look based on the lobbying reports whether companies are doing climate lobbying, have the dollar amounts associated with it, and then do the signing based on where the executives of the companies are privately donating money to. Yeah? So that's how and we use, right? The important point is we use the private donations as a signal of the climate stance. Of course, for the company, if it's anti-climate, it may be better to lobby with a Democrat, right? Because these are marginally the more important ones. That's not the point. We use it to do the signing of the kind of political perspective of the company. Now, if you don't like the measure, it's the core part of the paper, but we also have alternative measures in the paper. So there is an NGO that also classifies lobbying of companies, InfluenceMap, and we also use their measure. It's highly correlated and similar. We don't know exactly how they create it, but they're certainly not doing what we do, but it's highly correlated with what we are doing. And we are also measuring the direction of lobbying based on whether a company is relatively dirty or clean relative to the emissions of the industry. Right? So if you have relatively high emissions, you have strong incentives to do anti-climate lobbying, and so would classify or sign your lobbying as anti-climate. And if you're relatively green, we would consider you more on lobbying on the pro side. If you're interested in this, we have made all the data available. Now, there's a link at the end of the paper to OSF. You can download all of the data. For all of these firms, and for a pretty long time series, you can get the numbers. Right? So if you write a paper on something else and you want to control for the kind of lobbying of the firms, you can use the data. So let me give you some numbers. So we find that in about 10.6% of the firm years that there is anti-climate lobbying, and about 8.5% of firm years there's pro-climate lobbying. We find that on average, firms that do anti-climate lobbying spend $280,000 conditional at the intensive margin of firms doing anti-climate lobbying. And pro-climate lobbying is about $180,000. Is that big or small? Well, I can tell you that there's a huge skewness, of course, in there. There are some firms that spend millions. Yeah, and I can tell you that it's about 10% of the typical lobbying amounts that firms spend. Now, here are the biggest anti-climate lobbyists, right? This is aggregating across our sample period, the lobbying amounts. Number 1 is Southern Company, utility. Then we have ExxonMobil, we have Chevron, we have BP, we have American Electric Power. So it's oil and gas and it's utilities. right? So for example, Southern Company has spent, according to our classification, more than 80 million on anti-climate lobbying. They also have some pro-climate lobbying, which makes sense, right? They may also do a renewable energy project where they may hire a lobbyist that knows a lot about pro-climate regulation for that project. And we also take these lobbyists' political stances into account. So that's why you also see a little bit of blue pro-climate lobbying here. And these are the biggest pro-climate lobbying firms. What you see is there is interesting within industry variation, right? In the utility sector, there are some utilities do anti-climate lobbying and others that do pro. Well, probably because some benefit more from pro-climate regulation because they're more leveraged in terms of renewable energy than the other firms are. Then something that we discovered when working on this project was related to camouflaging. So we figured out that over the last years, increasingly, firms were referring to abstract bill codes in their lobbying descriptions rather than mentioning climate or carbon or other terms. They were disguising the lobbying that they were doing. And an abstract bill code like HR 5376 requires additional context to understand that it's the Inflation Reduction Act and that this is something that may be anti-climate lobbying that the firm is doing. Here's an example. FedEx, they spent 5.3 million on anti-climate lobbying in 2009. And back then, 60% of this lobbying amount we could classify by simply looking at keywords, climate-related keywords in the issue description. Or keywords and have written out bill codes, bill titles. Bill titles, important. By 2022, this percentage dropped to just 4% if you just look at the keywords, or 34% if you look at the keywords and bill titles. The remaining anti-climate lobbying can only be detected if you use bill information and the abstract bill codes. Now, in response to this trend, a lot of investors actually worry a lot about a lack of transparency in corporate climate lobbying. Here's an example. This is Norges Bank Investment Management. In their climate change expectations of their portfolio companies, and you probably know Norges Bank is the biggest asset owner in the world, they explicitly say, we want your companies not just to align with the Paris Agreement, but also be transparent about the lobbying you undertake. Now, very briefly, what firms are doing more camouflaging and less camouflaging? I don't want to explain in detail how we measure it, but basically we find that those firms that move from no lobbying to anti-climate lobbying, they're more likely to camouflage the lobbying. So you enter the area of lobbying, you're more likely to camouflage. You don't want others to see it. And also if you change the political stance, move from anti to pro-climate, even though it's just marginally insignificant. So I'm running a bit out of time, so I'll be a bit shorter on the next part, which is to see a little bit how the lobbying relates to corporate business models. First, we show that if you explain corporate lobbying, anti and pro-climate lobbying, that's the dependent variable here, and we call it intensity because we scale by firm assets to account for size effects. What you see is that firms that have larger emissions or emission intensities, as you would expect, spend more on anti-climate lobbying. What firms spend more on pro-climate lobbying? Well, in the bottom panel, you see firms that have more green innovation, have more green patents, because they benefit more from pro-climate regulation. We show important within industry variation. This is looking at utilities. Within that sector, you see that utilities that rely a lot on coal and natural gas do much more anti-climate lobbying, while firms that rely a lot on nuclear, the EU classifies that as green, spend more on pro-climate lobbying. So it's not just a sectoral thing. It's within a given sector that you have some firms doing pro and others doing anti-climate lobbying. In the paper, we show anti-climate lobbying is associated with more future climate incidents measured by REPRIS and also higher carbon emissions. We argue that anti-climate lobbying in part is undertaken to prevent future climate regulation or to avoid regulatory costs associated with current or future climate-related incidents. Now, I'm going a little bit into difficult terrain because now I'm going to talk about the financial market consequences. And I say that as someone who is not an asset pricer. So please keep that in mind if you believe I'm misusing terms or alike. So Marco is sitting in the office of Patrick Bolton, as I understand, and you may know Patrick and Marcin's paper on the carbon risk premium, where they show that firms with larger carbon emissions have higher returns, and therefore there is evidence of a carbon risk premium. We are running their regressions, where on the left-hand side, rerunning their regressions, where on the left-hand side there is the excess return of a company, and on the right-hand side, instead of carbon emissions, we have the climate lobbying, anti and pro, and the difference between the two, because some companies do both. And we split the sample into 2002 to 2009 and 2010 to 2022. What do we find? Well, I'll first present the results and then I'll interpret it. We find that firms that spend more on anti-climate lobbying relative to firm size do not have different returns from other firms in the early period, but have higher returns in the second period. And economically, as you see here on the slide, the effects are pretty large. So firms that spend more on anti-climate lobbying deliver higher returns. This is very hard to kill. It holds after controlling for emissions. It holds after using cost of capital estimates as a proxy for expected returns instead of realized returns. It even holds in the paper if you do Farmer Macbeth or portfolio sorts. It's a hard to kill result. Now, why is this the case? I'll try to convince you it's because the higher returns reflect a risk premium. It does not reflect mispricing. You may know that the standard alternative explanation to risk is mispricing. So it could also be that they have higher returns because the market is increasingly surprised of how great these firms are. Their earnings surprises, these firms are more profitable than the market thought. And because of this, the stock prices go up and you see a positive link between anti-climate lobbying and higher returns. We show in the paper, and you see it also here, there's no such evidence for a mispricing or unexpected earnings jump. We believe it's really risk. Why do we believe it? Well, I show you two results. I show you that when the firms are filing their lobbying reports, when the market sees about the lobbying, the market worries about the risk, and the valuations of these firms that are doing anti-climate lobbying are going down in an event study setting. And you know, lower valuations mean higher expected returns. I show you similarly that returns of the anti-climate lobbying firms are lower at times when climate-related regulatory uncertainty rises. And they're higher when it declines, also in event study settings, which is again consistent with a risk story. Here's the first evidence. So these are cars around the filing of these lobbying reports, and you see that when the anti-climate lobbyists file their reports, and you have to file them within a few days, so it's really at the end of the quarter, that the market responds negatively when it sees that firms are doing anti-climate lobbying. The valuations are going down. Here's the second evidence, right? So two event studies of events where either climate-related uncertainty declined or went up. The first event is when Senator Lindsey Graham dropped support for the cap and trade bill, the Waxman-Markey bill. That came unsurprisingly. It came surprisingly. Lots of papers, including the AR paper, used it also for identification. And what you see here was when this cap and trade bill was basically killed, taking away regulatory uncertainty, anti-climate lobbyists, these companies, saw an increase in their valuations. And the opposite holds for firms that were doing pro-climate lobbying. And exactly the opposite happened when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, the biggest climate bill in the US history, where also lots of people say it did come as a surprise. So there it was the anti-climate lobbyists that saw a decline in their returns. Now, why is it risk? This is what Sustainalytics argues. This is not me. I'm just showing you the numbers. Here's what one of the major ESG rating agencies says. Sustainalytics says anti-climate lobbying can constitute an investment risk by damaging trust in firms or leading to name and shame actions, so reputation risk, and by leading firms to not adjust business models fast enough in the hope that the lobbying is successful. This is my cement company example. You are not decarbonizing because, at least in the short term, you believe you are successful through the lobbying. Transition risk. What I even find more convincing is this here. This is a shareholder proposal through Climate Action 100 Plus. You may know, similar to the investor coalition I mentioned at the beginning, there's a global coalition of investors that are basically targeting the 167 dirtiest companies in terms of emissions and try to get them greener. They make shareholder proposals. So here's a shareholder proposal on behalf of Climate Action 100 filed by CCLA. And read this. So this is for NextEra Energy, a big carbon emitter. In the shareholder proposal, these investors say corporate lobbying that is inconsistent with the Paris Agreement presents increasingly material risks to companies and their shareholders, as delays in emission reductions undermine political stability, damage infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Further, companies face increasingly reputational risks from consumers, investors, and other shareholders because of the anti-climate lobby. So they want the company to stop it. They believe it enhances shareholder value if that lobbying-associated risk goes away. So let me conclude. 3 takeaways. We construct a new data set of large climate lobbying, of corporate climate lobbying, and you can use it. We show that the largest anti-climate lobbyists have more carbon-intensive business models than other firms, and that firms that spend more on anti-climate lobbying earn higher return. We argue it reflects a risk channel. And as I said, the paper is available on SSRN if you search for the title, and you can also, through the paper, see the link where we have the measures available if you're interested in those. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the questions that you may have.
Great, Zacharias. Thank you very much. So we have another 12 minutes or so. We already have some questions that came in on the chat. So I think some of them are clarification questions. So I think we can start with those first. So Jesus Salas has asked 2 questions, but I think, let's take one element that he asked for, which is just to clarify again how you measure the lobbying. So I think the amounts that you measure are very clear, and you also explain the frequency, basically every quarter. Mm-hmm. So you can observe how much money the firms spend, and then what they spend it on. So the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, you can also observe, and then you get through the camouflage. So you're pretty sure about what they're actually spending money on. Okay, so I think so far that's very clear. Right. Yeah. Now, I think where there's a question here is, how do you then decide whether they lobby for or against the Inflation Reduction Act? And he asks about executives. So I think that part would be good if you could just explain that again.
Right. Yeah. So the first attempt that we made was trying to understand whether we can infer the direction of the lobbying from the lobbying reports. So unfortunately, so you can use that kind of a language model to see whether, if they mention Inflation Reduction Act, they mention any keywords that indicate that they lobby against it or in favor of it. So that was only possible for about 20% of the issues that we had. So therefore, we had to take this indirect route. So we had to say, okay, to do the classification, what kind of actions by the company or its executives are informative of the climate stance of the company? And so there we said, and Tesla is the absolute counterexample, of course. Yeah, we said that to get it roughly right, let's look at where the executives of the company are privately donating to. If they privately donate to the Republicans, then they probably are more anti-climate. And so therefore, the firms they work for, right, if you think of a matching model where kind of also the political view of the company and the firm are matched, which is plausible, that then this lobbying amount that we identify is classified as anti-climate lobbying. And likewise, if the executives donate to the Republic, the Democrats.
Okay, so that's very clear. Now, is it so? And you didn't take the sector or the activity of the company because you mentioned before large incumbents that are carbon intensive. You didn't use that because then it would become completely endogenous. And there will be borderline cases where you can't be actually sure. And I think you showed one case where it goes for and against. Okay, is that right?
That's a great point. So we have it in the appendix. We kind of show that these, especially these return results, go through if you classify based on whether you are relatively more dirty compared to your peers in the industry. Right, so it's very similar in terms of the results. But you pointed it out correctly. That's more endogenous than our measure. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Influence Map. They, of course, go to social media filings. They look whether communications firms are being hired. For example, in the Voice Through Divestment paper, we found that the Independent Petroleum Association of America paid FDI to get opinion pieces into the newspaper to basically argue against divestment. I mean, could you, identify proxies of that sort, that clearly show you that through other channels, this firm really pushes just in one direction rather than, because I think this is what, Jesus is saying in his question, relying on the executive seems a bit,
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
anyway.
And thanks, Jesus. It's great to have you here. So I think there are 2 points. So one point is, and that's a shorter point, that of course a lot of the lobbying does happen through trade associations, like you just mentioned. It's just incredibly difficult to link that to companies. Now we did it as good as we could, and we also have that more as a robustness measure. And the reason why it's so difficult is first you have to define out of all the 1 million plus trade associations, which ones are climate related. And we do that. I mean, we basically look at one other paper that has identified a set of those that are climate related. And we have looked at where our sample companies are members of, right? Like the American Petroleum Institute, probably Exxon is a member of, and have also taken those. Now you have that list of all the trade associations. Now you need to get the members because you want to connect it with the firms, right? So you need the members. You need to know, of course, how much they are lobbying, but that you have the lobbying reports of these associations. Now you need the members, and now you have 1 million that is spent by an association. How do you connect it with 100 members? So what we did was we looked up the membership fees and then used that as a weighting scheme. And if we didn't have that information, we used the relative size of the members, right? And so you see already lots of assumptions in between. And then eventually we have an amount of the indirect lobbying and connect it to the company. And the indirect lobbying is about roughly 1/3 of the total lobbying. Now, the second point that you raise with social media and so on. So this is what we are capturing is maybe just the tip of the iceberg, because you, of course, capture with social media something else, which is public opinion. We capture how the Lobbying Disclosure Act defines lobbying, which is influencing federal policymakers. Right? This is not public opinion. So the next paper to be written is exactly what you mentioned. Try to do what you did in your paper, but now for climate lobbying, and try to see whether one can compile all of these data, or maybe use Influence Maps data that they already have and write a paper on this. Right. So my ExxonMobil example from the job interview, what they were doing in terms of the scientists that they were kind of using or abusing. This is not lobbying. This is public opinion influencing. So that would be great to capture. Yeah. But by the way, you may also wonder, why don't we go at the state or county level? Yeah. The reason is that for only about half of the states, you have similarly detailed data as you have at the federal level. So we can't do it at scale.
Okay, so then Ellen Quigley asked another question, which is really about the time series properties of your data. So she essentially asks, why are people not, I think it's a positivist question actually. Are people counter-cyclical? So, for example, I mean, I'm reading this into her question. If the wind manufacturers had foreseen just how averse, well, they could have heard the speeches about dead birds and all of this. So you might have had an inkling what might have happened to wind power, if the Trump administration comes in. Why did they not join Mar-a-Lago or, the Washing Club of the Children, or some of the things that the fossil fuel industry reportedly did in order to get into the, the good graces of the administration that has a good chance of coming in. So, why is the lobbying not counter-cyclical, or should it be counter-cyclical, or would you expect it to be counter-cyclical?
Right.
And if not, why not? It's surprising.
It's a very good question.
Ellen usually asks very good questions, so this is one of them.
No, this is a very good question. So let's take that piece by piece. So first, we do look at the time series, and I think an important point that we make is we are not saying that these companies are thinking that they are wasting shareholder value. Right? So we do believe that companies think that they do the lobbying in the best interest of the company. It just seems to be that the shareholders think about it differently. I say that because what we find is that the lobbying varies over time, that there's a lot of money spent around important bills. And we have it in the paper, a table, a figure where we show this. So whenever there's important regulation like the Markey-Waxman Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, you see a lot of lobbying around it. In fact, in these regressions that I showed you on these two events, we're using only the lobbying amounts that were related to these bills when measuring anti and pro-climate lobbying. So that is definitely the case. Now, a second point, and that's a paper to write, is why don't we think about this as an arms race where you have anti and pro-climate lobbying, and at some point they should kind of balance each other out. Right, so kind of doing this at the bill level, I think would be something super interesting, and kind of see whether the passage of a bill is at least influenced in parts based on how much the two sides are spending. So I think that would be a great paper. You can take our data to write that paper, actually. Now you're unmuted, Marco.
I must have muted myself. Okay, so that's why I was muted. So we have another question from Jorge Perez, which is slightly more technical. So he asks whether you observe any differences, if you checked basically, and observe any differences in the ownership governance structures of the firms that do lobbying and don't do lobbying.
Yeah.
Or lobbying to one of the two sides.
Yeah. So great question. So
do you, for example, observe private companies? I guess you don't. This is all listed companies.
No, it's also we have only listed companies here, but you also observe lobbying from private companies. We just focused on listed companies. But there's one test that we do, which is we show that those investors that are selling around the disclosure of the lobbying, of the anti-climate lobbyists, are those that you would classify as more climate conscious, in the way that I've been classifying that with some of the work with Laura and co-authors. Right, so it is those investors that are climate conscious that seem to exit around the information that the firm is doing anti-climate lobbying. Yeah.
Right. So I fear we are out of time. So let me join in what people have said online, that it's a really brilliant project. You kind of strategically stop when it gets really hot and exciting. So I know that people don't like to do updates, because we've published this and so forth. But, if I may encourage you and your co-authors to keep going, because I think, once we look at 2025 from 2026, provided we can still publish the research and get the data, I think then, things might be even more interesting and exciting, and maybe more depressing, maybe more optimistic than what you show already. So again, congratulations to Javier. You've done it again. Not only is it brilliantly executed, but also super interesting and relevant. So thank you very much.
That's kind, Marco. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marco, and thank you so much, Zach. I'll just echo the hope that you'll update the paper. I was thinking the same thing about what's going to happen going forward over the more recent history, as well as what are some of the policy prescriptions that you might make, which I know you may be reluctant to do here, but whether more disclosure is an answer. Obviously, this idea of just lobbying generally, the value and utility of that is a larger question that a lot of times economists have pretty strong opinions about. So I'd be excited to hear about that, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about that in the future. But with that, I would very much like to thank you, thank Marco, and thank all our participants for their engagement. I'll just give a quick plug for the rest of our speaker series. So this is the last of our speakers for the fall. But in the spring, we'll begin in February 5th. Will be, I think, our first speaker of the spring series, and that will be with Ruth Schmidt, who is an applied behavioral scientist. So a slightly different take. But with that, we hope you'll join us, and thank you all. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.